Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar video. This is going to be my review, my in-depth analysis for Netflix Avatar episode 5, which is N105, Spirited Away. So this is definitely one of these more kind of controversial episodes in terms of I think some people really don't like this one, some people think it's okay, and there's a bit of kind of everything with this one because it's a kind of unique attempt at doing this episode. It's effectively our 107 Winter Solstice Part 1 adaptation, but they do some quite interesting things with it. Some of it I do think is good, and it's a nice improvement. Other stuff feels like it adds on and maybe overcomplicates the episode. So, as I say here, I have some kind of confusing, conflicting thoughts back and forth on if I admire the kind of expansion of the episode, because it's a pretty simple initial episode, or is it very, very overcomplicated and a bit messy? I think it's certainly messy in the context of overall what the season is kind of trying to do and some of the character arc stuff that we'll get into. But on the positive side of things, spirit world mechanics for the most part are presented accurately. There's some weirdness about the whole Gyatso situation and what exactly Wan Tong talked about with regards to why Katara and Saka can't hear him, but the core, how you enter the spirit world and the difference between your separate being your spirit being separate from your body in the physical world versus actually going to the spirit world, that's presented very accurately, which I do very much appreciate. But it is sort of overcomplicated because it's not just hey bye, it's Ko is here, brought up from the finale, and the Fog of Lost Souls is here now because we want to do character stuff here. And so that's the point here with this episode. It's just there's a bit of everything going on. And to be fair, the next episode, 106 Masks, is kind of a similar thing where I think it's one of the better liked episodes. For a lot of people, it's their favorite episode. It's part of this arc, so this has to set up things for Masks to kind of be what it is. But obviously it has, I'd say, overall better material, and we get into issues like, Katara and Sokka. Their role in this episode is the only Katara and Sokka stuff in this kind of two-parter towards the end of the season. So they're not really involved in the next episode because of what we do here, and that creates issues as well. So let's get into the recap here. So we start, of course, off with the group running away from some firebenders. There's the implication that this is maybe the reaction to Sokka's dating attempts, trying to date a Fire Nation soldier. But mainly we build up to the reveal of course, the burn scar running through Senlin Forest, as we see here. But the first part's sort of interesting because we see Katara doing the kind of ice pillar and then ice disc move, which it's revealed that she actually made up herself by observing what earthbenders do. And so Aang kind of praises her for that. That's the sign of a good bender, that you can create your own moves when you kind of run out of the obvious stuff to do. But of course, this ends up not really amounting to much other than it's, I guess, set up for Katara's arc of becoming a master by herself. But I don't think a lot of people are super impressed with how they overall did it. But, the scene is fine so far. And then we land down at the burned forest. Of course, Aang blames himself for this because the Avatar is meant to protect nature. And we pretty much get straight into the acorn sequence from the original episode. Momo finds it, gives it to Katara, and Katara explains to Aang that, in time the forest will grow back. The kind of cycle of life and death will happen, that there will be a forest here again one day. Don't blame yourself too much for this, because it's the Fire Nation who's responsible, not you. So after this, Sokka then kind of sees this little girl watching him, and he manages to connect to her. It's a nice little scene here. He rhymes. This is where the Bonzu Pippin-Paddle-Optocopolis, the third reference, comes up. But basically they follow her back to her village, Senlin Village, and we just see that the village is on guard, and we're about to see what the reason for that is. So it's all relatively good. It's pretty accurate to the original so far. And then we find out that it's not just the Fire Nation. Strange things have started to happen since the forest was burned down. The land, in a way, is working against them. So people have had to leave to get food, but they haven't returned. So what's happened to them? It's otherworldly. And Aang realizes that it's literally true. Spirit world stuff, so he's going to help here. Because he feels he failed with the forest, he's going to step up here to save the people. That's the character arc they're going for here, of him accepting his kind of responsibility, as we'll see. Very quick scene here of G getting Zuko on the trail by mentioning that like he saw some reports of kids playing with ice in Senlin Pass. I think this is not a fantastic scene because the intent of the scene is meant to point out that Zuko is very rude to his crew, but G comes across as being a little bit idiotic here by not reporting this initially. So Zuko's kind of correct to kind of be like, really, blocks of ice in the middle of the Earth Kingdom. So, you know, it's just one of those kind of things where it's maybe not thought about enough because it's just a transition scene. Then we get into something where I think there's a little bit more to talk about. An Azula scene here that's quite interesting. So basically she gets Xiao his promotion. Ozai ultimately ends up agreeing with her, but he kind of doesn't like that she kind of tried to do it by manipulating him, and he immediately kind of saw through it that prove yourself to me through resilience and dedication like Zuko did in finding the Avatar, not through flattery and kind of your words, basically, that sort of thing. And we just get the idea. We go from very confident Azula, manipulative Azula, which is quite good, to Azula is very much taken out by Ozai kind of bringing up Zuko, saying that you're not good enough in a way, I want more from you, and she kind of doesn't really know what more to give is sort of the idea. For me, it feels like it's a little bit just, it's maybe too much like, oh no, what am I going to do from Azula? There's too much worry, I think, here in this early presentation. I think she should be a little bit more confident. I get they're trying to do the thing here where they characterize Ozai and also Azula. But it's maybe on both sides of things. Like, would Ozai really use banished Zuko to, you know, bring Azula up? I don't really think so. I think Ozai is the sort of character where if he's banished Zuko, he's not talking about Zuko anymore, basically. That you understand maybe in book 3 when Zuko comes back to the Fire Nation. That's maybe when Azula feels like she needs to be a little bit defensive around Zuko, but the fact that it seems like Ozai can get to Azula just by mentioning Zuko at this early point maybe feels like it's just a little bit like jumping ahead too much, trying to present like too much with Azula too early when we don't really know her that well in this version of the show. But like I said before, I like the Azula Xiao stuff. I like that she is the reason he gets promoted. But then we move on to the spirit world. So Aang basically is the one to kind of talk about this stuff. The forest is an area where the barrier between the realms is thin. And yeah, Avatar is the bridge between the worlds. And he's just going to go bring the people back. It's pretty standard plotting. And it's, again, accurate 107 stuff. But we'll quickly move past this, obviously. He references Boomy being like the Avatar has to do the impossible. And yeah, Sokka manages to find the area where the energy is the strongest, and this is where Aang's going to meditate. They point out the scar on the kind of nose of the Heibai statue, which comes back later on. That's really the kind of main thing from this scene here. Then we get the actual spirit world mechanics done very well, and you can see from the visuals here, this is great because we're in the physical world. Aang is a blue spirit. In this version, of course, he also brings Katara and Sokka out of their bodies, but this is accurate. And then they transition over into the spirit world itself. And so they're no longer in their spirit forms because they're in the spirit world. And because that whole world is kind of like that, they don't look different, and that's why it kind of is like this. Yes, I think it has to be acknowledged the spirit world itself doesn't look fantastic because it's just a forest with a filter, and then later on we see a cave. It's not very interesting looking, but I get it. They didn't want to sort of like blow their budget on some crazy full-on CG spirit world stuff, but it's still not like super interesting what they do. And yeah, that's just literally them crossing over. It's a cool scene. I think it's nice the way they do it. And I think it was the right choice for this version of the episode to actually go to the spirit world. And I actually think it works. And these are the sort of changes that I think you need to do for this version of the show, is that you can't just leave out Sokka and Katara. I think you have to bring them along with you on some of this stuff because you can't adapt every single episode. And so, yeah, bring them on the spirit world journey here. Absolutely fine. This is basically your introduction to June episode, but also at the bar, we get the whole thing with the patrons talking about like the pirates, canyon crawlers, effectively just presenting the idea that everyone in the world now knows the Avatar is back, and Zuko is incredibly worried because everyone's going to be looking for him now. But yeah, Nyla and June looks pretty good. We don't get to see too much of Nyla, and of course June's performance I think is pretty well done in a reasonably similar role to what she has in the original, just slightly adjusted to fit the different way that the kind of plots are panning out ultimately. Then into I suppose the first notable spirit world scene, Wan Tong. What's he doing here is the question, of course. So yeah, we get some ideas like the worlds are linked, they're separate but connected, which is a nice way to explain it. Yes, it is just an off-color forest, which isn't great, but we do meet Wan Tong. Interestingly, not named within the episode, he just calls himself the Knowledge Spirit, or the Spirit of Knowledge. So yeah, we just get your classic spirit things where they don't like humans. Humans aren't meant to be here in the spirit world. And we then address this dynamic of Aang can talk to him no problem, but Sokka and Katara only hear him as an owl hooting, basically. And Wan Tong explains that, you're the Avatar, of course you can comprehend me, because you're a deeply spiritual, powerful being. But these two humans, they're not meant to be here, so they can't actually comprehend what I'm saying. That was a bit weird. I don't think you needed to do that. I think that overly complicates the situation when otherwise, like, I don't think that is our actual understanding of the spirit world necessarily. I get spirits can choose to be like seen or not, but this is a bit like much perhaps. But the point here is just that, yeah, it's going to be dangerous, very dangerous for Katara and Sokka in the spirit world. Not so much for Aang, but the threat here is that it's not that it's worse than death, they point out, because it's not just that your body will die, but then you'll reincarnate in the cycle effectively. It's if your soul is devoured or captured by one of these dangerous spirits, the loss of your soul is like a permanent death. So that's something you don't want to deal with, of course. Interestingly here, there is setup for Gyatso. Wan Tong says there's someone who lives in a stone hut not far beyond the woods. And he may know basically what's up with the other people that they're looking for from Zenlin. So follow the path to him and don't go off the path is the kind of details here. And yeah, he just warned them about the fog of lost souls without saying it in as many words, that like, yeah, there's a spirit that will reveal truths, that will show someone who they truly are. And sometimes that truth can be painful is the kind of idea here. So some decent stuff, some nice knowledge from Wan Tong, but it's like, why are we doing this here? What does this mean for like book 2? Have you introduced Wan Tong ahead of time because we're actually going to the library, or is this in place of the library? Because of course we don't do the Xiao backstory with the library to set up the spirit stuff. This is our Wan Tong moment here for whatever reason. I think it could have been any other spirit realistically. Like, I actually would have liked it perhaps if it was the Yue Fox spirit that was just talking to them here, and she talks to everyone, but then she has the separate scene with Sokka. I think that's an easy way to do it, because she's obviously been to the spirit world a few times. But anyway, next up we have the next Azula scene here, and again, this is where some confusion comes into play in terms of what is the real intent of a lot of these scenes. So we do see Azula with blue fire, but the build-up is nothing, the aftermath is nothing, the scene itself is just like a split second to show off blue fire. So it's like, what? Like, if you don't know the significance of it, they've not pointed it out like at all. And it's barely really highlighted in the screenshot because it's a blink and you'll miss it style moment. So like, it's not that Azula's training was necessarily building towards blue fire, because she never said that that's what she could have potentially achieved. It's just, she does it. Is it meant to highlight that she gets very angry and this is where it comes from? Mei does stop her, at least that's sort of characterful that it's Mei, not Ty Lee, the one to sort of get a little bit physical with Azula here. Ty Lee gets the slightly characterful moment of her being the one to say that, you know, Azula's the best, she's perfect. But Azula says that, like, basically perfect is not good enough. And again, we see the very worried look on Azula's face here about this whole situation. And it's just the question of, should she be this worried given what's actually happening here? Should she be so kind of badly manipulated by Ozai here? I get it, she's going to turn this around in the coming episodes, but it just feels like, Where's the arc? You need to do more than this to kind of present it properly, and it's just not super effective. Where like, I don't think you get enough on Mei and Ty Lee. I'm not sure you're characterizing Azula enough, and I don't think you're really making too much of a detail about her techniques. So what is the takeaway here? And it's not that much, surprisingly, even though it's a reasonable attempt, obviously. Iroh hires June, has to convince Zuko, yeah, we need to work with bounty hunters. You know, a little bit of the whole, like, Zuko likes to do things in the right way, but to stay ahead of everyone else, they have to hire the best. And that's the basic idea here. So a pretty fun scene overall. But we move on to the spirit world stuff. So next, we get Sokka freaking out about invisible spirits. Aang reveals that Wan Tong told them that it would be dangerous. They'll have to face a truth, potentially. And then we see Heibai. And I believe this is like the only Heibai scene. Like, we just drop Heibai as we go between episodes, effectively. Aang's going to plant an acorn in the ground, and that's going to be it for the plot. Creating a bit of a weird situation, as we'll get to, in terms of what actually happened here. Because Heibai is part of this, but he's not really the focus of this, which is odd overall. Yeah, Aang notices the scars the same, and this is where it gets a little bit weird, where it's like, wait, you have the scar of the Fire Nation across the landscape, but then you have a literal scar on the statue that is also on Heibai. What? Is it damaging the statue damages the spirit? Is that correct? I feel they should have explained that connection a little bit better. But basically, Heibai just separates everyone. They realize, this is where Aang and Katara realize they can't bend. And yeah, fog engulfs the area as we just, you know, separate the group here so we can have the separate stories play out. Then we get into Fox Spirit Yue. So I'll bring forward the idea that this is actually Yue, because I think in the context of this episode, we have to talk about what they actually attempt to do here. And I think it's reasonable, the idea of, like, to make sort of Yue and the whole relationship situation different than, like, say, Suki. Instead of just arriving in a place and immediately starting a relationship, Sokka and Yue have already met before via this scene, which creates a bit of an interesting dynamic. I think the voice acting performance is kind of cool here, and like I said, I think this spirit probably should have taken the place of Wan Tong, perhaps, because it's not obviously clear what the Wan Tong setup necessarily is. But yeah, it's a three-tailed fox spirit here for Yue. Obviously, the major question is, why is it not just Yue in some sort of a normal spirit form, a moon spirit form, maybe a koi fish form? But they're just obviously making decisions. The explanation from later on is that this is Yue dreaming and traveling into the spirit world via her dream. So maybe that explains it, but it's still not particularly well explained. So she talks about, you know, Heibai. The Heibai is in pain. Heibai's not a monster. He's just hurt. And that's what happens, you know, when someone's in pain. That's what pain does to people, effectively. So does Sokka know what it means to be hurt? And he kind of laughs it off. He doesn't really address it. And it's setting up the idea of he's going to be hurt by the truth from the fog shortly. But the connection here is basically recombobulate, discombobulate, and this will be what links the later episodes into this episode in terms of, oh, it was you type situation. And then we get the first actual Fog of Lost Souls scene. This is Katara going up first. And it's really unfortunate here because I have such mixed feelings on this, because while I think it's a pretty accurate, like, attempt at doing the Katara Kaya backstory, the timing of this I also feel is kind of not great. And what I mean by that is that Katara's arc in this entire season is about her training waterbending and then basically the memories of her mother. The problem with this scene is obviously that they're bringing this forward from, like, season 3 for whatever reason. We've already seen, like, a lot of the main pieces of this, and then it's meant to show Katara a truth. And other than, like, I suppose, mentioning the death of her mother again, what is the kind of intent of this? Because we already had the scene with Jet where she apparently, at least temporarily, has dealt with her feelings about her mother in terms of, like, when she thinks about it, she remembers the good times with her mother rather than the bad. why are we going back to this? Because this is now nearly every episode of the season so far that this has been brought up. Katara remembering the death of her mother. And I just think it's really unfortunate that the episode where we finally get the full flashback is the one where it feels like it has the least impact. Because coming out of this, it's just like, okay, so we're going backwards with Katara's character arc about this. Because the only real takeaways from this are, like, in this initial scene, it's like Kaya says to Katara, you know, I believe you will bend one day and you'll show the world just how powerful you are. And then as we go into the second kind of part of this, I do like the moment at the start where Katara realizes like what day this actually is, and she tries to like change the events. Like there's this real desperation of like, don't go in there, Mom, but Kaya still goes ahead with it, of course. The only thing I can think of, and I'll explain this, but I'll also immediately say that they don't bring this to light within the episode itself, so I feel I'm doing too much service to the episode by trying to explain it here. But Katara tries to waterbend when we're in the confrontation with Yon-Ra. So Yon-Ra actually sees some waterbending going on, and you almost get the impression that in this version of the show, he might have walked off realizing that Kaya doesn't really know anything, or like he believes that she doesn't know anything. But because Katara waterbends, it kind of leads him to potentially nearly finding Katara. And it's only when Yon-Ra gets right to finding and discovering Katara that Kaya acts and basically has to get herself killed to give him the waterbender. So is the truth meant to be this idea of, I got my mother killed? And there's an excessive level of guilt added on top of this, because that can kind of work the idea of Katara's waterbending is hindered by the memories of her mother, which is a reasonable arc. It's basically the Aang movie waterbending arc, but done with Katara and her mother instead of Aang and his people. It's just that it kind of is almost better done in the movie, surprisingly, because it takes so much time, and they don't make the obvious point, I think, in this episode of like, you know, Katara feeling that she is responsible. They kind of show you that and maybe imply it to a certain degree, but because Katara doesn't actually like get the moment where she almost like tells herself the truth, I don't know if there's the impact of this scene. But then we see the big connection here. Katara is taken by Ko the Face Stealer. And it's like, whoa, what are we doing here? Oh, that's interesting. That's different. And then we go into the Saka Fog of Lost Souls section. So this is the memory of his ice dodging trials. Effectively Bato of the Water Tribe, done like a bit before Hakoda even leaves for war. So they've turned this into like a flashback scene, which is kind of interesting to do it this way. And I think it's somewhat cleverly done with the arc that they have for Sokka. This is where it works. I think the Katara is probably, unfortunately, the weakest of the three character arcs. Sokka's probably the best overall. And Aang's is just like in the middle for reasons we'll get to. Hakoda gives him the Mark of the Wise. Bato says that, oh, we could have pretty close, and Sokka's like, oh yeah, we lost control, didn't we? I didn't know what to do, and if not for you, Bato, I wouldn't have even succeeded. And Hakoda still gives him the mark because, like, hey, choosing the crew, and a good crew, is part of the test, so you pass. But then he gets outside, and the older boys make fun of him for damaging it, but still passing. He then eavesdrops on Hakoda and Bato talking about what happened. And we get Hakoda saying that, like, Sokka nearly wrecked us. Bato does try to defend him by saying that, like, even I barely saved us. But Hakoda's like, no, don't do that. Like, everyone in our tribe is, in our family line is meant to be a warrior and pass this test. And Hakoda's like, I had hoped he would do better. Maybe not everyone is meant to have people's lives in their hands. And so Sokka is incredibly upset at this. It's a very emotional scene here, and it actually hits because guess what? This is actually a kind of unwanted truth of this actually happened to Sokka. Like, he has this moment where the truth is that he seems to know at some point, it's a very negative view, but like his father is the one who feels he's maybe not suited to be a leader or be responsible for people. Is he meant to be a warrior? That sort of idea. But then why I like this with Sokka's arc is because you have the contrast of that clearly at some point after this scene, Hakoda still left for war and gave Sokka the responsibility to look after the tribe when he left. And so there's these two Hakoda scenes, one good, one bad, and Sokka is kind of obviously, I guess, confused about his arc kind of because of that. Like, does my father believe in me or not? In one situation he didn't, in another he absolutely did. So it's this setup for, like, when he actually meets Hakoda again in the present day, that's going to be actually sort of almost a kind of big important scene, because Sokka has actually had a bit of an arc about this, about the responsibility and the way the other characters have talked about that responsibility being placed on him. And he's learned to be a better warrior from Suki, but also that he has other talents from the Mechanist. And it's like, that's actually a character arc, because we're exploring a similar path, but different things in each of the episodes that add on to that path. And it's a massive contrast between that and like Katara's arc, where it's just waterbending, memory of her mother, rinse and repeat. Like, that's it. That's all we're doing. But yes, Sokka's also taken by Ko. Then we get the Aang kind of Ko sequence, which is kind of interesting because it seems like something very similar is going to happen to Aang, where he seemingly arrives at the Southern Air Temple, but he immediately knows it's not real and kind of comes out of the illusion. So the fog never takes effect on Aang. Instead, he just is confronted by Ko. And so the Ko, of course, is like, oh, my old friend, the Avatar. A past life tried to slay Ko for taking the face of someone he loved. This is Umi, of course, in relation to Avatar Karuk, but we'll learn about some other stuff, because he also says that the Avatar stole something from him, which is kind of interesting. Aang doesn't know what this is, but we'll find out about this in the next episode. And then it'll be addressed a little bit more in this one. So Aang does ask Ko about, like, hey, where are you hiding everyone? And Ko's like, I won't talk about my food. So he is planning to eat them, of course. At this point, Aang makes a run for it and arrives at the stone hut that Wan Tong mentions. And this is Aang's actual kind of character arc moment here, because inside is Monk Gyatso. No, it's not a vision. This is actual Monk Gyatso's, like, spirit, basically. And they are delighted to see each other again. Of course, Aang does think it's an illusion, but Gyatso manages to convince Aang that he's real by cheating at Pai Sho, which I love that, and like just the giggle that Gyatso does, and it's like, oh, it is you. No way anyone could fake doing that, basically, that sort of idea. And it's very fun, it's very emotional, because they did show you the flashback scene, like, in context. You really feel that Aang has needed this all this time, and it does very much work. The issue is probably just the explanation about what has exactly happened here doesn't feel great, because Gyatso says that, oh yeah, everyone else during the attacks died and moved on in the Great Cycle. He chose a different path, to not move on, knowing that Aang would need him. And Aang is like, wait, you chose not to, like, take the next stage of enlightenment? And Gyatso's like, yes, that's what I did. And it's like, wait, what? Because the point that they're doing here is that, like, as mentioned by Wan Tong, is effectively that for basically the last 100 years, Gyatso has been here in the spirit world, active, waiting for Aang to arrive into the spirit world at some point. But the second he meets Aang, it's a time limit, because the second Aang leaves, Gyatso has to leave as well. And it's this really vague situation where, like, why is this a one-time use situation, but, like, you can just persist for as long as you need to, but the second you meet Aang, it's done. I don't really understand why they made that kind of caveat to it. But again, there's more explanation that we go through here. There's a lot of information here. Gyatso can't tell him how to be the Avatar. He's, tells Aang to be more confident in himself. He explains the fog. It's a spirit prison, basically. They seem to more highlight it as being a place rather than an actual spirit in this version, but, like, same difference, I suppose, roughly. And basically, this is just Ko's hunting ground. So these two sort of quote-unquote work together, or Ko just is in this place. And it highlights, of course, that the whole Heibai situation is just that Heibai off-screen took villagers into the spirit world and gave Ko more victims. So at the moment, Ko has a massive amount of people, all the Senlin people, as well as Katara and Sokka. So Ko's got lots of food stored up. And yeah, if he eats them, their souls will be lost forever, so permanent death type thing. Ko is a primal spirit, and basically there's no way to defeat him. Aang brings up the whole, wait, Ko mentioned I stole something from him. Gyatso says previous avatars have had run-ins with Ko, including that Roku once got the best of him. Doesn't know how, but that might be somewhere to look. And so the setup here for the next episode is that Aang has to go to Roku's temple to find out how to kind of get one over on Ko, to get Ko to release all of these people. So what is the mystery here behind this? And we'll see that in the next episode. And then we get this moment here. So this is the kind of goodbye scene between Gyatso and Aang. It obviously retroactively ends up being their kind of last time, I guess, they get to see each other. But Aang thinks there's the opportunity to see each other again. So I like the acting from Gyatso here, where he knows he can't tell Aang the truth. So he has to say that, like, yes, we'll see each other again. But you know deep down looking at it that, yeah, this is a one-time only thing, isn't it? But he stops him to say that you could not have done anything if you had stayed. You know, you couldn't have saved us, you couldn't have stopped the Fire Nation, and you couldn't have prevented the war. You would have just died with everyone else. This is not your fault. Let go of your guilt over this. And so this scene obviously very heavily connects all the way back to like episode 2 at the very beginning, the kind of like funeral scene that Aang has for Gyatso, where he does blame himself, wishes he was there. And so this links in perfectly with that, to be like, don't feel guilt for this, Aang. It is good that you weren't there. You are now in this different era. You have a chance to actually do something to save the world. You know, grasp it, basically. Don't be held back by the past, that whole idea. And yeah, the setup here is like, yeah, Gyatso has to let him go, knowing this will be the last time they see each other, but Aang doesn't know that. And this is where I think this was like the first ever line, wasn't it, that we got from the trailers? Time is a funny thing. It all gets mixed up. Only way to keep it straight is to remember what really matters. And so we're in wrap-up mode here, basically right at the end. Aang returns to his body. He uses the notebook to get information on Roku's temple. He buries the acorn beneath the Heibai statue, knowing that he's in pain. And as far as I'm aware, I still need to go through episode 6 in more detail again, but I believe this is just the full-on resolution to the Heibai stuff. How episode 6 resolves itself, which is also pretty quick, is basically just the co-plot for the most part. Like, we don't really come back around to the Heibai stuff necessarily, because I don't think we get to see Heibai in his panda form at all. So yeah, Aang's going to make this right. He's going to save his friends. Gyatso then gives a massive speech over a bunch of scenes. So the scenes that happen are basically that we see Zuko isolated from his crew on his ship, Azula training into the night as Mei and Ty Lee sleep. We see Xiao get the Yuyan archers and his promotion, and also Aang gliding into the Fire Nation. So just a bunch of quick fire scenes over Gyatso saying this interesting speech here that, you know, it's not word for word, it's paraphrased, but, you know, keeping sight of what's important can be hard. Feels like we'll always be alone. The only thing keeping us company is our own pain. We are the problem, especially with things out of our control. We must let go of pain and regret. Remember what it is we're really fighting for, the ones we love. The light to guide you through the treacherous times and the darkest of nights. So it's a pretty nicely worded one from Gyatso there to kind of give some highlight stuff. But you have to say by the end of it, it's like, okay, it's 107 to a certain degree. It's leading into 108 for a very different reason. The stakes are high, but they're different stakes. And it's like, I don't think it's awful. Like, I know some people really don't like this episode. At least to me, I like Spirit World mechanics, so I think I appreciate quite a bit of what this episode is trying to do. But it is stuff like, it does feel in retrospect, if you don't want to use Heibai, don't use Heibai. If you're going to include him, do him properly. Like, it's clear you wanted to do Ko here, and I'm just like, just do Ko here. Give the Heibai stuff to Ko and just set it up that, like, they come across some sort of a spiritual thing, they go into the spirit world, and it's all about Ko and the Fog of Lost Souls. Heibai is unfortunately not important in this version of the show. Just do that. That I think is ultimately fine, because the importance of this episode is explaining the spirit world. It's not specifically Heibai overall. But then the fact that, like, Wan Tong's in the episode as well. The UA stuff I don't really mind, though again, explain the fox form, please. But the big thing for me is definitely just the 3 arcs within the Fog of Lost Souls. The Aang one is, I think, good, but just let down by the vagueness and hand-waviness about, like, Gyatso and not really highlighting what exactly he did to achieve this one-time spirit visit thing that can last for 100 years but stops immediately once he meets Aang. That's very weird. The Sokka one, I think, works. You can criticize if the Sokka arc works over the course of the episodes, but I think it's an effective use of that to add to the arc here. The Katara one, unfortunately, feels just, I think, a little bit repetitive, borderline out of place, that if you were going to do the backstory, it feels like you either wait until the end, or you place it in a different spot, or potentially you just have that play out in relation to the jet scene that you had, which was good. But it just felt misplaced here because there was no takeaway that really adds to Katara's arc. It's just backstory, do with this what you will, even though you've seen most of the main things, and there's no Katara reacting to it necessarily, except in the basic idea of she of course doesn't like this tragic backstory, but we don't really get the sort of how does seeing this backstory again impact present day Katara in relation to what we've already dealt with. That's not kind of presented as clearly as it needs to be. The Azula stuff again is just a case of, I think it's mostly fine, but it's just, I think we have a slightly not as confident as maybe she needs to be presented Azula here, in that it feels like they maybe need to do quite a bit in the season 2 introduction of her to really get her across as much as they need to. Mei and Ty Lee will effectively need to be reintroduced because we know so little about them and all this sort of stuff. So there are my thoughts on this episode. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are, but that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.